Case of the Bible, when we move into the next scene of the story, we have jumped ahead 400 years. And so 400 years later, we begin this next scene. And this next scene is really all about what I'm going to call the journey home. They started in their home in Canaan, but at the end of Genesis, they've gone down to Egypt, but Egypt is not really their home. And God has a purpose for taking them down there, by the way. For one thing, He gets them out of the influences of the nations around them, which ultimately this family and this great nation is going to go back and defeat and occupy that land. But secondly, 70 people go down, and over a period of 400 years, the promise that they would become a great nation, part of that is that those 70 have grown to over 3 million people strong that are the descendants now of the 70 that went down into Egypt. And there comes this point in time where God now is going to take them back home to the land of Canaan. We usually think about this part of the Bible as the Exodus, and that's part of what happens. But the purpose of the Exodus is to get them back to their homeland. And so it's a journey home. Two of the books of the Old Testament that really tell this part of the story, Exodus and Numbers. And then what I wanted you to remember is we looked at a list last week of the 11 of the 17 historical books that tell the story, and how that those others sort of fit in but don't really push the narrative forward. They sort of hang on the spine was the language we used. And so both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, although they're part of this section of the Old Testament called the historical books, they aren't really part of the narrative in terms of moving the story forward. They fit in to the narrative that's contained within Exodus and Numbers. So this is the scene that we'll look at first of all tonight. And I probably should get the right notes to do that. The journey home. This gives us a little bit of an orientation geographically. And of course, when Abraham first comes in to the land, this is what we normally think of as the land of Canaan or Israel or Palestine or the Holy Land, whatever. And obviously the family has, the 70 people have come down here into the land of Egypt. And there in the land of Egypt, sort of the first subplot is that we find out that in the land of Egypt that they are living in bondage now. And the conditions have radically changed from what we saw at the end of Genesis, where Joseph is the number 2 guy in all of Egypt, and suddenly his family has come down, and you know that they're treated almost like royalty, but times have changed. I mean, one of the things I think that's important to get a feel for in the story of the Bible is that massive periods of time elapse in this story, so that by the time we get to the end of tonight, we're going to have covered 1,000 years of history just in the part of Act 1 that we've covered here, and by the time we get till the end of the Gospels, and really, I guess by the time we get to the end of the Gospels, it'll be 2,000 years of history we're going to have covered. And you think about this contextually. I was thinking today, most of us think about 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, it was a different world. And, I can remember 50 years ago, really as a little kid, we were just starting to get televisions. I mean, our kids listen to us and you say, well, when I was growing up, we didn't have computers, and they look at you like, man, you're a dinosaur, Dad, And, but the reality was 50 years ago, we were just getting, televisions. And then think about 100 years ago. I mean, 100 years ago, we really just started driving cars. 100 years ago, one of the things that's interesting about the year 1903 is Henry Ford began producing Model Ts, and the Wright brothers had the first, airplane flight, and Harley Davidson began building motorcycles, and Sigmund Freud began practicing psychotherapy. I mean, by the way, Harleys and and psychotherapy, two different approaches to mental health, and it could be debated, which is more effective. Personally, I've needed both, but anyway, that's some of us are just crazier than the rest of us. But 100 years ago, it was a different world. Well, this is 400 years have elapsed. So contextually, it would be like 400 years ago in our history, the first colonists were arriving at Jamestown, 1607. So this is a huge amount of time that has elapsed, and we're gonna kind of see how different parts of this story are compact and different parts, really go over a long period of time. But suddenly, the story is now a story of bondage, of slavery, and cruelty, and actually, it's a story of genocide. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Hotel Rwanda, for instance, and just this inconceivable, inhumanity taking place of how, one group of people can seek to totally annihilate another group, and what that looks like. And really, that's what's going on with the Jews at this point in time. Pharaoh decides there's too many of them. I mean, there's 3 million, okay? There's a lot of Jews at this point in time there in Egypt, and he wants to implement a pretty radical plan of zero population growth, and what it is every male baby born, kill him. Okay, and so they're in this horrible situation, but fortunately, in the midst of this situation, the Jews cry out to God, and God hears their pleas, and so God raises up a deliverer, and the deliverer that he's going to raise up and provide deliverance through, of course, is a man by the name of Moses. And by the way, again, talking about stories within stories within stories, think about just the story of this guy's life. He's floated down the river to spare his life, and his sister kind of walks along the bank, to see what's happening to the little basket as it floats down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter takes the baby out of the river, and suddenly this slave, that was going to be killed, ends up in the household of Pharaoh, and as Pharaoh's daughter is sort of holding the baby, Moses' sister runs up and says, "Oh, do you need somebody to help take care of that? Because I can probably find some for you." Goes back and gets Moses' mother. And now Pharaoh is hiring Moses' mother to take care of the baby that she was supposed to kill that's now growing up in the household of Pharaoh. I mean, it's a great story.